Erev Tov again, everybody. Second week of Vayikra, second week with Rabbi Dr. Shai Held as we're making our way through Vayikra. And this is the first of his two essays on Parashat Tzav, and timely also a little bit of a link to the Korban Pesach and Pesach. And the end of this essay, I reserve the right to Shabbat Hagol Drasha. We'll see what happens. So, any slight repetition for this, my internet connection. Good to go.
What does that mean?
Okay, Tzav, number one, no leftovers, the meaning of the Thanksgiving offering. The sacrificial offering associated with giving thanks to God, the Korban Todah, differs in crucial ways from other sacrifices mentioned in Leviticus. And I'll just say a semi-related note about the relationship between Vayikra and Tzav, which Tzav reviews many of the same korbanot that are mentioned in Parashat Vayikra, a little bit more sort of from the perspective of the Kohen as opposed to the perspective of the person bringing it. Just, a different angle on some of the same korbanot. So the sacrificial offering associated with giving thanks to God, the Korban Todah, differs in crucial ways from other sacrifices mentioned in Vayikra. If we discern the rationale behind those differences, we will have gone a long way towards understanding the meaning of gratitude in Jewish piety and spirituality. I will also mention at the outset that gratitude is a major theme of Rav Shai's teaching and writing, gratitude as a pillar of Jewish theology, and he references in the footnotes a couple of other essays that deal with this theme. And I remember the one time that I recall that he spoke Shabbat morning, I don't remember if it was a Shabbat or Yom Tov morning at HIR, he spoke about the centrality of gratitude, and he shared something which a Torah I've also heard from Rav Avi. I don't know where it originates, about the fact that we begin our days with gratitude, so much so that the very first word is modeh, not even ani, but modeh. That the first word we utter when we get up in the morning is a word of gratitude. The burnt offering, the olah, described in Leviticus chapter 1. Is totally given over to God and is thus completely consumed by the fire on the altar. The sacrifice of well-being, the Zevach HaShlamim, described in Leviticus 3, of which the Korban Todah is a prime example, is different. Although parts of it are consumed on the altar, other parts are shared by priests and the people bringing the sacrifice as a sacred meal. Most of the grain offering, mincha, described in Leviticus 3, may be eaten, but only by the priests. The sacrifice of well-being, again the shlamim, in contrast, may be consumed by those bringing the sacrifices as well. So we have korbanot which are entirely burnt on the altar, we have korbanot which are eaten but only by kohanim, and then we have the shlamim, this category of well-being. I've also seen it translated appropriately as fellowship offering, peace offering is another way of translating it, in which the people who bring it partake of it, as do the Kohanim, as does God, in the sense that some of it is burnt on the altar. Bible scholar Baruch Levine suggests that this permission expresses the very purpose of the sacrifice, to afford the worshipers the experience of joining together with the priests in a sacred meal, at which God's self, was perceived to be the honored guest. Right. So when those bringing the korban and the Kohanim eat, and the korban is burnt on the altar, it's as though those three parties are all joining together in a meal. But the Thanksgiving offering is not like the other sacrifices of well-being, meaning even within the category of shlamim, we have something distinct about the Korban Todah, the Thanksgiving offering. Whereas most other sacrifices of well-being may be eaten until the third day, Parashat Tzav tells us that the flesh of the Thanksgiving sacrifice of well-being shall be eaten on the day that it is offered. None of it shall be set aside until the morning. Whatever is left over until the following morning must be burned. Just to see that in context in our Parashah. So in Leviticus 7, we start off talking about the Asham, the guilt offering. We get some of the details, what was eaten by whom. We get a little bit about the Mincha. And then in verse 11, we start talking about the Shlamim, Zot Torat Zevach HaShlamim. And then we have description of if it's offered as a Todah, if this, well-being offering is offered as a thanksgiving offering, here's what's brought. And then we're told about that, Ubesar Zevach Todat Shlamav, the flesh of the thanksgiving sacrifice of well-being, again, from within the category of Shlamim, specifically here, the Todah, the thanksgiving offering. Yom Korbano Yachel, has to be eaten on the day that it's offered, and none of it can be set aside until morning. And then an example of the contrast within the Shlamim offering is if it was not a Todah, but a Neder or a Nedava, a votive or free will offering, then Biyom Hakrivo Azivcho Yeachel Umi Macharat Vanotar Mimenu Yeachel. Then it can be eaten on that day and the next day, and only on the third day is the leftover burnt. So we see clearly again from within the Shlamim, the Todah is set aside that it has to be eaten on its day, and anything left over the next day is burned. The question is why? Why does the Torah find the prospect of leftovers disturbing? Why must the thanksgiving offering of all sacrifices be eaten on the very day it is brought? Rabbi Yitzchak Abravanel offers one explanation. The Torah's purpose, Abravanel argues, is to publicize the miracle the person is celebrating. The fact that a great deal of food must be consumed in a short time leads the thankful person to invite relatives, friends, and acquaintances to share in his meal and his joy. He will thus have the opportunity to tell them of the wonders and miracles that were done for him, and God's name will be publicly glorified. Okay, so we have the take of the Abravanel here, which is that the fact that you have very little food, not necessarily very little, the fact that all the edible food that comes from this korban has to be consumed that day means that you're going to have, but necessarily have a lot of people come over to participate in that korban. And if you are expressing thanksgiving and having a lot of people come over to share in that thanksgiving, you're going to be, telling a lot of people about what you're thankful for, and that will glorify God's name. And that's so that's one take, and the take of the Abravanel. Enter Rav Shai, who says, I'd like to propose another, perhaps complementary way of thinking about why the thankful person needs to invite others to share in his or her meal. The idea that trying to not have any leftovers and the leftovers being burned, meaning consuming it all, in a short amount of time with other people. One approach is then you'll have the opportunity to tell of the wonders and miracles and glorify God's name publicly. And now he wants to offer this alternative related approach. The nature of gratitude is such that it is inherently outward looking, as he now begins to explain. Think of a moment in your life when you have had an overwhelming sense of gratitude to God or to another person. Imagine especially a moment when you received something, whether a much needed meal, a kind word, or a gesture of deep love, that you were not at all sure would be forthcoming. You may well notice that when you fully inhabit the sense of gratitude, you feel an urge to share the gifts you have received with others. When we are moved to the depths of our being by having been given something, we seek to become givers ourselves. A grateful heart overflows. Gratitude, crucially, is not just a feeling. Many moral philosophers maintain that a core aspect of gratitude is the desire to respond. Philosopher A.D.M. Walker, for example, writes that pleasure at being favored, however undiluted, does not amount to gratefulness in the absence of any desire to make a return, meaning the fact that you are shown some favor, no matter how sort of intense that is, and the happiness that you have about that, that's not gratefulness, unless it evokes in you some desire to do something as a result. What distinguishes being grateful from being merely pleased or glad is the grateful person's desire to make a return. More precisely, he wants to favor another because he has been favored himself. And I think there's really two aspects, it seems to me, here in this little quote. One is this desire of return, and the second is the fact that the return is actually not reciprocal as much as it is what we call paying it forward, right? Someone did something for me, that gratitude provokes a response in me, and the response is actually to do something for someone else. It could be back to the person who did something for you, but it's not specifically about that. It's not specifically responsive, reciprocal, but it's responsive, outward focused. Gratitude is, psychologist Robert Emmons insists, a moral emotion in that it leads to behavior intended to benefit others, right? It's not a value neutral thing. It's a affirmative moral feeling, because it should lead to the desire to do good for other people. A crucial component of authentic gratitude is an urge to repay or pay forward the kindness we have been shown. Gratitude is the bridge between the realization of how much I have been given and the commitment to be a giver myself. I think I want to pause here for a moment, just hear reactions to that description of gratitude. Again, as always, feel free to disagree and say, no, I think gratitude might just be that feeling, deep feeling of appreciation, acknowledgement. And again, there's more to develop on what this means for the Korban, but does it, in the way in which Rav Shai really invited us to feel and kind of inhabit that space, does it resonate? What does it lead to in you? Yes, Bracha, go ahead.
Well, naturally around this time, I'm thinking about Pesach. And one of the many pivotal moments in the Seder is when we're supposed to talk about the Exodus from Egypt. And the more that we talk about it, the more praiseworthy it is. I think what we're being pointed to is that we need to take on that experience and relive it. And if something amazing and positive has happened to you, you just can't stop talking about it. So I had that kind of connection.
Beautiful. Right. Maybe a reading of that. Right. We can ask the question: why is it the case that you're referring to the comment, I believe, in the Mishnah in the 10th parak of Psachim, which says, "Kol," and we repeated it in the Seder night itself. Kol hamarbeh lesaper b'yetziat Mitzrayim harei zeh meshubach. The more one tells about the Exodus, the more praiseworthy it is, and that could it actually relates, I think, in many ways to the Abravanel versus Rav Shai. One possibility is because it simply sanctifies God's name more, and that's a goal of the Seder night, is to tell about the wondrous things that God did for us, because that's an ends unto itself. And another possibility, complementary, I think, as Rav Shai argued, is that it awakens in us the more we detail, right? Thinking more about the lines of the Haggadah, Kama ma'alot tovot lamakom aleinu. How many were these incredible actions and steps and levels that God did for us? That detailing both deepens our appreciation and therefore awakens, hopefully, that desire in us to do for others, and also kind of gives us examples of the wide range of things we could do for others. So that resonates very much. Yeah, great. Any other comments or reactions to this gratitude framework? Yeah, David.
So what's interesting about this is that it's not legislated. It's not legislated generosity. There's no tax imposed here. I would say that the offering has to come from, you take 10% and you give it to the poor. What it is, though, is that because of the size of the animal being slaughtered and the difficulty of consuming it in one fell swoop, that it's a nudge, to use the Chicago school term, as opposed to a nudge. Anyway, I thought that was very clever and moving.
Yeah, wonderful. But, rather than making it so formally structured as a chiyuv. It just it's a structure that allows for and creates space for and directs towards this kind of response. Yeah, Lance, go ahead.
Okay. At one point that we read, Rabbi Held says, I'd like to propose another, perhaps complementary way of thinking about why the thankful person needs to invite others to share in his or her meal. That is very, very strange to me. Why his or her meal? Doesn't that mean that women and men are equal?
Yes.
And isn't that what Rabbi Held believes? Isn't that
Yes.
what Hadar is all about?
Yes. Where are you leading us? I don't know yet.
Where I'm leading, I'm just suggesting that he's raised Orthodox, but he has a serious problem with Orthodoxy, right? And he went to JTS, and Hadar, I think, is an attempt to hybrid liberal Orthodoxy and conservative egalitarianism, right?
Yeah.
What attracts you to Rabbi Held?
His way of thinking, his way of, I think, indeed, bridging some of those worlds and also bringing together, the wisdom of a lot of different dimensions of Jewish tradition and beyond Jewish tradition to kind of bring moral messages from the text.
And he's a big advocate of Rabbi Heschel, right?
Yes.
Whom you guys honored, didn't you?
Yeah, we had a special program. Exactly.
Yeah, and Rabbi Heschel's daughter is Susanna. And Susanna would get an aliyah at Hadar, but not here.
All true. At HIR, she would get an aliyah at Women's Tefillah when it meets.
Right, but not in a mixed gender service and sanctuary.
Right.
Okay.
Great. Steve, and then Rev Scott, and then Dad. I don't hear you yet. See if you can unmute.
What this says to me is that whatever we have is from God. It's not due to our own efforts. It's from God. And if that's the case, I think God commands us to share with others, show gratitude by sharing with others the bounty that we have received through God's favors.
Yes.
Must be shared. So this is part of it to me.
Beautifully said. Beautifully said. Rev Scott, go ahead.
So it occurs to me that most people, I think, when they have a celebration, get a lot more out of it by sharing it with other people. And I think, it's fairly logical that by including other people and allowing them to rejoice with you and your good fortune, it adds to your pleasure and your joy. The second thing I wanted to mention or ask is that the other thing that comes to mind when reading about the Korban Todah is that it is exactly like the Korban Pesach, right? You're not supposed to have, there's not supposed to be any leftover. You've got to eat it all up. And in the Torah, it even says, if you don't have enough people, invite your next door neighbor or whatever to come and join you. So I'm wondering whether there are other parallels.
Excellent. Yes. Rav Shai will touch on that at the end, and it's also percolating in my mind for this Shabbat Hagadol. So we'll see where we get to go from there. Dad, go ahead.
Scott read my mind.
Okay, amazing. On the connections to the Korban Pesach. Okay, great minds think alike. Okay, Lance, hold on a little longer. We're going to go further to the second half. Okay. Again, picking up where we left off. Gratitude is the bridge between the realization of how much I have been given and the commitment to be a giver myself. What I am suggesting, back to Rav Shai's first person voice, is that the laws around the consumption of the Thanksgiving offering are intended to express and inculcate a core religious value. When one has been the beneficiary of God's kindness, one is expected to bestow kindness oneself. And here I think, playing on David's comment, this is both a normative claim, gratitude should be inclusive and outward looking, and a descriptive psychological one. True gratitude by its nature, as others have also commented, is inclusive and outward looking. Otherwise, as Walker argues, it is merely, not judgmentally merely, but just descriptively merely, it is merely pleasure or gladness, but not gratitude. The Torah tries to teach something similar about the joy Jews experience during the 3 pilgrimage festivals. You shall rejoice in your festival, Deuteronomy teaches us, with your son and your daughter, your male and female slave, the Levite, the stranger, the fatherless. That's actually, I think, probably a more technically correct translation of yatom, not orphan, although orphan may also mean that in English, but nowadays I think we think of orphan as meaning having no parents, and fatherless is what its, I think, technical biblical usage is. The stranger, the fatherless, and the widow in your communities. Deep joy is meant to be shared, as Rav Scott said. In this instance, it is not just one's family or friends who must be included, but also, and perhaps especially, those who are socioeconomically vulnerable. Maimonides, the Rambam, amplifies the biblical message dramatically. This is an oft-quoted Rambam and very appropriate here. While one eats and drinks himself during a festival, it is his duty to feed the stranger, the widow, and other poor and unfortunate people. For he who locks the doors to his courtyard and eats and drinks with this wife and family, I don't know if it's this or should be his, I'm not sure, without giving anything to eat and drink to the poor and the bitter in soul, marei nefesh in the Rambam's Hebrew, his meal is not a rejoicing in a divine commandment, simchat mitzvah, but a rejoicing in his own stomach, simchat kreso. Rejoicing of this kind is a disgrace to those who indulge in it. It's the Mishnah Torah from the Laws of Yom Tov, 6:18. Joy that is not at least somewhat outward looking, Maimonides forcefully suggests, is merely self-indulgence. True joy, Gerald Blidstein, late great professor of the Rambam, explains, overflows the boundaries of individualism and becomes kindness. Selfish rejoicing, according to Maimonides, is a contradiction in terms. Like gratitude, then, real joy looks outward. Like a grateful one, a joyous heart overflows, right? So I think he's almost sort of backing it up a step, right? If Walker's argument was, being happy with what you have or for what you've received is merely pleasure or gladness, and gratitude entails paying it forward or paying it back, the Rambam is almost saying, actually, even just true joy or gladness entails paying forward or paying back. The simple requirement that there not be any leftovers from the Thanksgiving offering thus teaches us a fundamental theological and spiritual lesson. We are not meant to rest content with being recipients of God's gifts, but are asked to become givers ourselves. God's gifts are meant to flow through us. This is really Steve's point as well, and not merely to us, to flow through us and not merely to us. As Christian theologian Miroslav Volf writes, we are not simply the final destination in the flow of God's gifts. Rather, we find ourselves midstream, so to speak. The gifts flow into us and they flow on from us. We are not just the intended recipients of God's gifts, we are also their channels. As channels, we exist not just to enjoy things, but also to pass them on. Our purpose is twofold, to flourish and to help others flourish. And I think while the emphasis here, and this is something I often think about, kind of my job is always to lift up the underappreciated dimension in a pairing, where there will always be people who will skew to one side or another. So I do want to say that while the thrust here, naturally assuming people's focus on themselves, is to talk about the idea of the helping others part, I think it's also the case that some people can't receive and enjoy the things they're given and are only sort of feel the compulsion to pass them on without actually being able to flourish for themselves. And that is the other side also. We most effectively help others flourish and effectively channel God's goodness to others when we actually take hold of it as it comes to us at the same time, I believe. In their very first encounter, God promises Avraham, then still named Avram, that I will bless you, and then adds that I will make you a blessing. V'hayei bracha, right? Ba'avarcha, and then later v'hayei bracha. God seems to want Avram to know right away that being blessed and becoming a blessing are thoroughly intertwined. The same double blessing is given to us. This is a quote of, let's check, of Wolf again. The same double blessing is given to us. If we just enjoy good things without passing them on, if we are blessed without being a blessing, then we fail in our purposes as channels. We are givers because we were made that way. And if we don't give, we are at odds with ourselves. The lesson is simple. Gratitude and hoarding are incompatible, even mutually contradictory. A genuinely grateful heart does not understand acquisitiveness or possessiveness. It's interesting. I'll note that there's an element of sort of the channels piece, and this last, sort of strongest statement doesn't understand acquisitiveness or possessiveness. That almost, it feels like it pushes to the edge, meaning if there's room to feel ownership over something, and this is sort of the tension around this. Sometimes feeling ownership over something helps us then share it more. So there feels, a little something to balance. But he's pushing in this direction strongly. Okay, now coming back, this is really the end, and we'll open up again, of course. The prohibition on setting aside any of the Thanksgiving offering until the next morning calls to mind another, good work everybody, parallel biblical prohibition, discussing the Paschal sacrifice, Korban Pesach, which is also a sacrifice of well-being. It is itself a shlamim. Exodus announces, you shall not leave any of it over until morning. If any of it is left until morning, you shall burn it. Very similar language. Something profound is at play here. Think of what we say near the beginning of the Passover Seder, if only we more often acted accordingly. All who are hungry, let them enter and eat. All who are in need, let them come celebrate Pesach. If one of the core lessons Israel is meant to learn from its long sojourn in Egypt is to care for the vulnerable and downtrodden, then allowing any portion of the Paschal sacrifice to be left over until morning should be unimaginable. Surely there is someone in the community who is hungry or alone, and who thus could and should have been invited to participate in our celebration. Leftovers from the Paschal sacrifice suggest that the lessons of slavery and liberation have not yet been fully learned and internalized. Leftovers indicate a failure of empathy. The prohibition on leaving over any part of the Thanksgiving offering reminds us that we cannot be at once grateful and self-enclosed. The prohibition on leaving over any part of the Paschal sacrifice is intended, at least in part, to remind us that those who are hungry are our responsibility, that we are to open both our hearts and our homes to them. Both laws tell us, open your hearts and open your doors. I will be wrestling with this, by the way, a little bit more on Shabbat HaGadol, because the halachot of how the Korban Pesach was actually experienced have some of this ethic, but are a little bit more complicated. You had to get in your groupings before the Korban Pesach was slaughtered. And once those groups were set, you kind of couldn't join somebody else or leave. But as I hope to argue, it seems like that was actually yet another, while on the face of it, it may sound a little bit rigid and less welcoming. I think that was actually done so that people would be even more planful and make sure that they incorporated anybody and no one would be left at the last minute without a place to join. But I hope to have more to say about that on Shabbat. So open it up again for comments, Lance, and then Dad, and anybody else.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I want to read this quotation from Leviticus. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the alien. I am the Lord your God. Now that's crystal clear, okay? Crystal clear about everything we've been talking about, except I'm not sure that the concept of leftovers under any circumstances should be taken as don't do it. And let me just point out that there is an organization in Israel called Leket Israel. Are you familiar with them?
Yes.
Okay. They are a national food bank, a registered nonprofit Israel-based charity, and the leading food rescue organization in Israel, serving 175,000 needy people a week. Now, what they do is they take the leftovers from restaurants like, I don't know, I have been to Leket. I have actually helped pack things at Leket, but I'm not totally familiar with exactly how they run their organization. But the idea is that they pick up leftovers and they distribute those leftovers. And as far as I know, they do not discriminate between Jews and non-Jews.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd like to also point out, very important, and that is the Paschal lamb sacrifice that we've been talking about, okay, is not done in Jerusalem at the temple. Why? Because the state of Israel does not allow rabbis, even Ben Gvir or whatever, to go up on a temple mount and sacrifice the Paschal lamb, even though there's a nascent Sanhedrin and blah, blah, blah. But non-Jews, this is the kicker, non-Jews today, next week, will sacrifice the Paschal lamb on Mount Gerizim. The Samaritans, they are non-Jews according to the rabbis and everybody else in the world, but not according to this Kohen, because they're Kohanim. Their religion is Judaism, but it is not Talmudic Judaism. And for that reason, the rabbis don't see them, don't see the Igbo, don't see the Kesach, don't see the Karaites as Jews. And of course, this is one of my pet peeves. We discussed it this morning in Rav Ezra's class. I'm trying to be consistent, but what's going on here? And I must say that I really like what Rabbi Held is saying here, because, and even I just picked up, there's sons and daughters, and there's an equivalence of male and female in what we just read, right?
Yes.
Is that in the Hebrew?
In which Hebrew? Where? Which?
Was they talking about in the Torah? To go back to where you just read.
Yes, absolutely. When it talks about rejoicing on the holiday, sons and daughters, yes, does appear in the
So
Torah.
there you go. So Torah Judaism is actually much more egalitarian than Rabbinic Judaism, right?
I'm reserving judgment on my answer to that question, but
okay.
in some places, yes. In some places, yes.
Well, it's to be fair, a lot of people have tremendous conflicts over this. And I just heard today a young woman on the radio saying that if the Netanyahu government really gets its way, the Orthodox establishment and the courts completely ignore women, and women will be one of the biggest suffering elements in Israeli society because of the right-wing Netanyahu government. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that this whole situation is black and white. I totally disagree with that. But it does mean that there are plenty of people who see the danger here as one of misogyny.
Thank you.
I'm not saying there really is or isn't. I don't have the ability to say that.
Yes.
But I'm saying that there are people who honestly believe that.
Yeah. Thank you. A litany of good points. Dad, go ahead.
So this got me to thinking about the Israelites. They were grateful, and they were sharing their gratitude with other Israelites. They were all in the same category. They were all in the same situation. So I got to thinking that there was another group of people that they may have been sharing with their good fortune. And that's the Eruv Rav, that are usually translated as a mixed multitude. But Professor Everett Fox calls Eruv Rav riffraff. They are, downtrodden. They're probably slaves. And the Israelites, all who are hungry come and eat. They can't share in eating the Korban Pesach. They're not circumcised.
Yeah.
But all who are needy, come and share the holiday with us. So you can come along and you can leave Egypt with us.
Yeah.
And it's almost as if the Israelites took them along.
Yeah.
That's a new way of looking at the Eruv Rav.
Yes, and they're on my mind also as I think about this is who I don't know yet whether they'll make it into the Shabbat Hagadol Drasha, but I've also been thinking about their place. So I guess we know where I got it all from. Thanks, Dad.
Thank you.
James, go ahead.
Two questions. One, can you paint a picture for us of what it must have been like on the temple? I mean, Rabbi Held says the person bringing the sacrifice and the Kohanim are eating together. Is that metaphorical, or are they actually eating together?
I ought to be able to, but off the top of my head, I don't think so. I don't assume that they ate their portions in the same place. I think when it says in that passage from let me find it. Hold on. To afford the worshipers the experience of joining together with the priests in a sacred meal at which God's self was perceived to be the honored guest. That was a footnote from Baruch Levine. I just don't know my Kachim well enough to say for sure if they could have eaten in the same if they would have eaten in the same place or not. I'm gonna make myself a note.
Right. The second point is, I agree with his first point about joy being, or gratitude being something you want to express with others. I think he glosses over the fact that the natural people you'd reach out to are not the people that are prescribed in Leviticus. Meaning, if I were going to share a big meal, I would probably first reach out to my family, or my neighbors or my friends. I don't think the fatherless and widow would be my first, invites. I think there, in fact, there should be more to say about that. That is the Torah kind of pushing us out of our normal comfort zone. He kind of went from like the natural instinctual to the, maybe none.
Right. Yeah, I do think, I think that's how he is presenting it. Let me just go back to that little spot. When he says the Torah tries to teach something similar about the joy Jews experience, right? Deep joy is meant to be shared, not just one's family or friends who must be included, but also those who are socioeconomically vulnerable. And the Rambam, talking about the difference between the selfish rejoicing and the true rejoicing, something like that. So I do understand. I was reading it as some of those people are in your natural group, and some of those people might not be your instinct, even though they are. I mean, it's a little tricky because they're, you know, right. Some of them are literally in your household, and some of them are in your neighborhood and community, but wouldn't necessarily be the ones you would reach out to initially. So I think it's a good question. Exactly what's intended by the Torah there, and then by the Rambam there, and those different concentric circles where, for example. Yeah. Rev Scott and then David.
So first I would say that if anyone were to extend an invitation to those who are most in need, it would be James. Having said that, I think it's worth mentioning that although it isn't necessarily our custom in the circles that we socialize in, it's not unusual that at a wedding or another simcha, there should be a table for the needy. And that was certainly a regular custom in the shtetl. And, you know, it even reflected in, in the script of Fiddler on the Roof, where it's clear that the beggar has the right to be supported, right? And I think it's worth remembering that as part of, our heritage.
Yeah. Beautifully said. Beautifully said. I already lost track. Who's coming up next? David, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to agree with Scott and go beyond. James, you're not on my screen anymore. Balderdash James. James, you are the living embodiment of someone who gives and somebody who has incorporated those feelings of seeing.
I'm going to have to sign out here.
And providing for those who are unprovided for. And if it's true that you tell us that's not a person's natural instinct, then all the more credit to you. And there's nobody I feel better than acknowledging before Pesach than you, James. And of course, Ann made you do it all, but James, in the end, you guys. So don't tell me about it not being whatever. You guys live it.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Well said. Great. A lot
I take back my comment.
lot to appreciate, and I know they're video off, but great to see Miriam. Great to welcome a friend, Evan, to our learning. And let's see. I have to look at the calendar. We're on for next Monday night. No matter busy though it may be, hopefully we'll get a chance to continue our learning as we get closer to Pesach. And if you can't make it, it's an excused absence in the week of Pesach, so no worries, but we'll plan to learn. And take good care, everybody. Love to mom and dad.
And Chol Moed?
Good question. TBD.
Stay tuned.
Yes, determined by whom? That's the question.
I'll ask Shira.
Good night, all.
Yeah, good.
Thank you.
All right, take care.